In the heart of the Middle Ages, the human body was not simply flesh and bone. It was a battlefield of morality. To lust was to sin. To sin was to betray not only your soul, but the social order itself. And for those in power, kings, priests, magistrates, that sin had to be punished visibly, painfully, and often permanently. This is the story of how desire, one of the most natural of human instincts, was transformed into something criminal, and how pain, public shame, and iron devices were used to keep it under control. It begins not in the dungeons of a sadistic king, but in the pulpits of Europe's churches. Medieval preachers described lust as a wildfire, a force that could tear apart communities, corrupt noble bloodlines, and bring down the wrath of God. They told villagers that desire was not merely a private matter, it was a threat to Christian civilization. This fear became the perfect excuse to tighten control over everyday life, especially over women and the poor. By the 12th century, Europe had been reshaped by the Church's growing influence. Canon law, the legal code of the Church, declared lustful acts not only sinful but punishable. Courts began enforcing strict rules on adultery, fornication, and prostitution. In these courts, the accused didn't just pay a fine. They often paid with their skin. Punishments for lust crimes varied wildly across medieval Europe, but they all shared one thing. The goal was humiliation. If you were caught in adultery in parts of France or Germany, you might be paraded through the streets, stripped to your waist, while villagers hurled insults, mud, or rotten vegetables. In England, the stocks, that familiar wooden frame clamping hands and head, were used to trap offenders in public squares. It was not enough to punish. The punishment had to be seen. But physical pain was always close at hand. In German towns, local records describe men and women who were whipped along the marketplace road for sins of the flesh. In Florence, certain offenders were branded with hot irons, a permanent mark of shame that ensured they would carry their punishment for life. And in more rural areas, crude mutilations sometimes occurred. Shaved heads, slashed ears, or worse. Perhaps the most infamous punishments targeted women. In the medieval imagination, women were often portrayed as the root of lust, Eve's daughters, bringing temptation wherever they went. Devices like the scold's bridle emerged in the 16th century. An iron cage locked around a woman's head, with a sharp plate pressed against her tongue to keep her from speaking lewdly. Though technically later than the early Middle Ages, it carried the same logic. Silence, restrain, and publicly display the offender as a warning to others. Even more legendary, though often exaggerated in modern myths, were chastity belts. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europe was not filled with jealous husbands forcing iron belts on their wives before leaving for the Crusades. Most real chastity belts were 19th century fantasies displayed in museums. But there were references to locking devices used in rare cases, sometimes to punish prostitutes or wayward wives. And these stories were eagerly spread by moralists to terrify women into obedience. The image of the belt itself became as powerful as the device ever could be. Meanwhile, men were not spared. In some jurisdictions, adulterous men faced castration. Chronicles from the early 13th century describe cases where rulers ordered brutal mutilations for seducers or rapists, using pain as both penalty and deterrent. While these punishments were not the norm everywhere, their shocking severity made them memorable, and that was exactly the point. This fear-driven world reached its height under the influence of inquisitorial courts. Though we think of the Inquisition as a hunt for heretics, accusations of lust and carnal sins often accompanied charges of witchcraft, sorcery, or heresy. Women accused of sleeping with demons, men accused of sodomy, all were seen as threats not only to faith, but to the stability of kingdoms. To control the body was to control society. Imagine the chilling scene. A cobblestone square at dawn. A wooden scaffold erected beside the church steps. Townsfolk gather, their breath rising in the cold air, as a bell tolls. An accused woman is brought forth, her hair shorn, her dress torn. A priest reads the charges. Fornication, lewdness, dishonoring her household. The sentence is not death, but a walk of shame through the town, whipped as she goes. Children jeer. Old women spit. And as she stumbles past, she becomes a living sermon, desire leads to disgrace. In cities like Paris, Venice, and London, brothels were both tolerated and tightly regulated. The paradox was striking. Lust was condemned, yet prostitution was considered inevitable. But when prostitutes broke the rules, the punishment was swift. Some were made to wear distinctive clothing marking them as sinners. Others were flogged or banished from the city entirely. In parts of Italy, offenders were forced to march naked to the city gates, carrying candles or crosses as symbols of their penitence. Across Europe, these punishments became a kind of theater, a grim performance in which pain and shame were staged for maximum effect. They were meant to terrify the audience as much as they hurt the accused. And behind every lash of the whip or clang of the stocks was a deeper message. Your body is not yours. It belongs to God, to your husband, to the law, to anyone who claims authority over you. The criminalization of lust was not just about religion, it was about power. Feudal lords, city magistrates, and even guild leaders used morality laws to keep communities obedient. If a man stepped outside the bounds of marriage or a woman was suspected of impropriety, punishment was a way of reminding everyone who set the rules. Even literature of the time reflects this harsh reality. Tales and sermons warned of lovers meeting secret ends, burned, blinded, or cast out. Troubadours sang of desire, but also of its dangers, describing nights undone by passion or maidens ruined by scandal. The message was always clear. Love and lust are not just personal risks, they are crimes against order. By the late medieval period, the punishments became ritualized. Fines, pilgrimages, enforced fasts, and public penance replaced some of the harsher mutilations. But the shadow of pain still hung over every accusation. When the church ordered a woman to appear barefoot in the streets, wearing nothing but a white shift and holding a candle, the humiliation was deliberate. She was to be both spectacle and warning. For men accused of sodomy, a capital offense in many regions, the outcome was often fatal. In Florence during the 15th century, records show that even wealthy or powerful citizens could be imprisoned, tortured, or executed for unnatural vice. In England, Henry VIII's 1533 Buggery Act made same-sex relations a hanging crime. The state had taken over where the church began, using the law to regulate intimate life through terror. Through all these centuries, pain became the language of control. Whips spoke where sermons failed. Iron brands told stories longer than any written law. And the threat of the scaffold kept hearts and bodies in check. But while punishments were harsh, it's important to remember that they were also uneven. Nobles often escaped with lighter fines while peasants bore the lash. Priests preaching chastity sometimes secretly broke their vows without consequence, while ordinary people suffered for the same acts. Lust was not only criminalized, it was weaponized, used to reinforce class, gender, and political hierarchies. Even so, records hint at quiet resistance. Lovers continued to meet in secret. Women mocked the laws by wearing disguises or fleeing to other towns. Men protected their mistresses from prosecution by bribing officials. And in taverns and marketplaces, people whispered jokes about the hypocrisy of rulers who punished others for sins they themselves committed. Across medieval Europe, justice was not only about punishing wrongdoing. It was about demonstrating power. When the church declared lust an offense against divine order, it also declared itself the ultimate authority over the body. Pain was not incidental. It was central. To control desire, rulers first had to control flesh. Consider the law courts of 13th century France. Officials kept careful records of cases involving adultery and fornication. These were not private sins to be whispered about. They were treated as offenses against the community. A woman caught in an illicit affair might be forced to parade barefoot through town, wearing nothing but a shift, her hair cropped short, her head dusted with ashes. Men accused of similar crimes faced whippings or fines, but the public gaze often fell hardest on women. Spectacle, after all, was part of the punishment. By the late Middle Ages, city statutes grew more elaborate. In some German towns, offenders had to kneel at the church door during Sunday Mass, holding candles of penance while neighbors looked on. The message was clear. Desire outside the bounds of marriage was dangerous, not only to the soul but to the stability of society itself. Shame became a weapon sharper than steel. Devices emerged to make that weapon visible. Iron collars, heavy with bells, marked women accused of prostitution or unchastity. The scold's bridle, a metal mask with a protruding plate to silence the tongue, was sometimes used not only on quarrelsome wives but also on those accused of sexual misconduct, as if silencing the mouth could discipline the body. The pain of the device was real, but its purpose was humiliation. The victim was paraded through markets and crossroads, turned into a living warning sign. This is what happens when desire strays. Across the Channel, England used its own arsenal of shame. Stocks and pillories were popular tools, where offenders were exposed to the jeers, rotten vegetables, and sometimes stones of the crowd. A man convicted of lewd conduct could be locked in place for hours, his head and hands immobilized, while townsfolk mocked him mercilessly. If a woman was charged, the punishment often took on a cruel theatricality. She might be doused in filth or forced to wear symbolic clothing, signaling her crime to everyone passing by. But there was another dimension beyond civic law, the spiritual courtroom. Inquisitors and confessors treated lust as a disease of the soul. Priests assigned brutal penances, long fasts, painful pilgrimages, even self-flagellation, to purge sinful thoughts. Manuals for confessors listed specific punishments for different offenses, carefully calibrated according to age, gender, and marital status. The goal was to discipline not just the body but the imagination itself. If desire could be made painful, perhaps it could be tamed. This logic reached its peak in the cloisters of monastic life. Monks and nuns who confessed to impure thoughts often subjected themselves to physical hardship. Cold baths in winter, lying on stone floors, wearing hair shirts that scratched the skin raw. These practices were not viewed as cruelty but as medicine. Lust was thought to be a fire. Pain was the water to quench it. The human body became a battlefield where holiness and desire clashed daily. Even secular rulers saw advantage in criminalizing passion. Royal edicts in Castile, Venice, and Prague imposed fines on brothels, outlawed certain garments deemed too tempting, and punished unchaste behavior with branding or exile. A nobleman caught in scandal might lose his titles. A peasant girl might lose her home. But the punishments always carried a lesson. Lust was not only a private weakness but a social threat to order and hierarchy. Some punishments were disturbingly inventive. In Italian city-states, young men accused of seducing respectable women could be forced to march through the streets in women's clothing, mocked as unmanned before the crowd. In Florence, officials posted lists of moral offenders in public squares, ensuring that shame lingered long after the act itself. In the harshest cases, authorities used iron cages suspended from bridges or city walls, where offenders were left to starve or freeze, a grim symbol of desire's supposed corruption. Throughout Europe, the fear of uncontrolled lust was often bound up with fear of women. Medieval writers portrayed female desire as dangerous, insatiable, and in need of strict control. Laws reflected these anxieties. While men's indiscretions were often punished with fines, women faced harsher, more physical forms of discipline: whippings, branding, or enforced confinement in convents. Lust was seen as feminine, chaotic, and therefore something to be contained by force. Yet not all these measures worked as intended. Despite the cages, collars, and public parades, human desire refused to vanish. Brothels continued to thrive, even when officially banned. Courts became overwhelmed with cases of adultery and fornication, suggesting that lust was far too powerful to be legislated out of existence. In many cities, rulers quietly tolerated what they publicly condemned, using moral laws less as a true deterrent and more as a means of control, especially over marginalized groups. In this tension between human passion and institutional power, myths began to grow. Later centuries would exaggerate certain punishments. Tales of chastity belts locked on young brides by jealous husbands, of iron devices so cruel they could not possibly have been real. While most of these stories were legends, they carried a kernel of truth. Medieval Europe did try to bind the body to bind the soul. The great irony is that, in trying to erase desire, authorities only made it more visible. Public punishments turned private sins into civic theater. Pilgrims whispered about who was seen in the stocks. Neighbors gossiped about whose hair was cut in shame. The very systems designed to crush lust ended up parading it through the streets for everyone to see. By the dawn of the Renaissance, humanist thinkers began to question these brutal measures. Scholars argued that lust was a natural part of human life, not merely a crime to be stamped out. But the old punishments did not disappear overnight. In rural villages, public shaming rituals survived well into the 17th century. The sound of bells on an iron collar, the sight of a penitent woman kneeling in ashes, still haunted Europe's marketplaces and churchyards. Looking back, we see how the medieval world tried to discipline not just behavior but the very emotions and desires that make us human. Pain and shame were used as tools of spiritual engineering. Yet desire proved stronger than the whip, the brand, or the scold's bridle. It slipped through the cracks of prison doors and echoed in the confessional, unbroken by centuries of punishment. The history of how lust was criminalized is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's fear of its own nature. In the struggle to control passion, medieval authorities revealed more about themselves than about the people they punished. And though the devices have rusted away, the questions they raise remain. Who has the right to police desire? And what happens when power tries to govern the most private corners of the human heart?